We didn't even get up here. Thank you. And thank you all for coming on a Friday night. This is great. And Michael, thank you very much for inviting me. When Michael invited me to speak on connoisseurship, I was thinking I would go through all of the Impressionists. And he was like, no, pick one artist. Well, the artist that I have to pick is Monet, because we have 33 of them, and I'm constantly surrounded by them. And I really thought this would be a wonderful opportunity for me to revisit Monet and to think about what makes Monet a Monet. So you're going to be seeing lots of these kind of juicy details tonight in the next 45 or 50 minutes as we try to kind of get beneath the surface of Monet. And I should also say, I didn't want to diss anybody else's paintings, so I'm sticking to my path. And then I saw in the New York Times they had the quiz, what is this? Is this a button? And, I think that we're all able to take these quizzes and figure out Monet because it's a motif. We know Sunrise Impressionism. We know that this was the painting that gave the group its name, and we know this is the sketch-like thing that says impressionniste. And also we could pick this one, what the hey, because we know that this is one of his signature motifs, and it's one that the Art Institute excels in since we have 6 of the 25 known paintings of this stacks of wheat moule. It gets a little trickier when you're not thinking about motifs that are easily recognizable with Monet, such as figure paintings, because he really abandons figure painting in the 1880s, and so he's not so known for that. So you have the Monet. I'm not going to tell you the answer. But I thought since Monet has occupied my life in many ways, not just because I study 19th century, but because we lend to so many exhibitions. Because we have 33, he's kind of our chit. If I want something from someone else, you can have a Monet if you give me that Renoir. And so this is just a few of the catalogs for exhibitions for which we have lent. And then we have ourselves done a number of Monet exhibitions since I've been at the Art Institute, the series paintings. In 1995, Charles Stuckey did a retrospective of Monet that went on for 6 months and that was hugely popular. And then most recently, Katie Kremnitzer, who's here in the audience, and I did Monet in Chicago. This was during COVID, so it didn't start when it was supposed to start, but it eventually did. And that was a pleasure to put together the people who gave us our Monets, because the Art Institute, out of the 33, only 2 have been purchased. The rest were donations. And then most importantly for this presentation is the online scholarly catalog that Stefan referred to that took over 3 years. It was launched in 2014. It's online, and it was a technical, complete evaluation of the Monets on paper, but mostly the paintings in our collections, with the science, with everything to look beneath the surface. And it is this project which is really underpinning what we're going to be hearing about tonight. Now, what makes Monet a Monet? Well, I thought I'd just write down a few things. So the signature style. So this is a lot. This is how he frames. This is his compositional strategies. This is the way his brushwork is. We think about Monet as staccato. We think about him as flickering. There are all these adjectives that we apply to his technique that make Monet different from his contemporaries. His exhibition strategies, in the beginning he didn't have any, but eventually he did have a way of controlling the way his works were seen. The condition plays a huge role in connoisseurship, because a great painting can be not so great if somebody's ironed it out when they relined it. Changing tastes. I'll be talking about this, but there is no way those late big Monets would have been bought in the 1920s. It just would have been unheard of. And then they became extremely popular. So taste and connoisseurship are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. And finally, the market, then and now, for Monet. So as I said, in the beginning, he really didn't have an exhibition strategy. He was just trying to survive. He was trying to make his name with the big boys in the official competition of the state-sponsored salon. And these are the two that he exhibited in 1866. One, a landscape already showing his incredible competence and his ability to present light and the atmosphere and that envelope that will become so important. But then a large-scale painting of his girlfriend, Camille, future wife, that he was trying to fit in with what was popular among painters at the time of modern life fashion. And so today, what I'd like to do is just go through some of the paintings in the Art Institute's collection and talk about them in the same terms that I've just discussed, and to see what makes a Monet a good Monet, what makes a Monet not so good. And so we're going to be looking at these paintings. I'm doing this more for myself so I can kind of keep on time and an agenda, and I see we're good. 1867, a big year for Monet, and he paints this wonderful work of Saint-Adresse. Yes, remember that Monet is from Le Havre, and this is a beach scene, but it's much more than that, and it's really getting us into what makes a Monet, because out of our 33 Monets, only one was painted what we call premier coup, like he was painting it, he did it, and it was done. All the others, he left it, he went back, he reworked it, it dried, he came in, sometimes he scraped it, sometimes he recycled canvases. So there's not a Monet of the, paints as the bird flies, as the myth is. He's an artist who is constantly struggling to get it right, and that requires multiple revisits to the same composition or starting anew. And this is a perfect example of that. So it starts out by being something completely different than the way it ends up. You're seeing a fishing village, Saint-Adresse, you're seeing the fishermen, and it was owned by one of our collectors, Mrs. Coburn, who lived in the Blackstone Hotel. It's one of the early Monets we had, so by 1933 we had pretty much 80% of the collection of the 33 we own now. So it was, and it's very similar to the Met's. It's the same time, it's the same summer. But the Met's painting is beautifully about the regattas, but it's also about the tourist class. It's also about well-to-do people. Whereas Monet, the only time you see this type of class with the well-dressed man and woman sitting on the water, on the beach, is in this one little vignette that, if I can go back to it. Do you see it there? Oh, I have a pointer. Hang on. Okay, here I am. This little thing here. But it didn't always start that way. In fact, and this is tricky and I hope it will launch, this is an interactive, and in this online scholarly catalog, which you can play with at home, you'll see that you can look at this under the same lights and the same kinds of examinations we do in the lab. And I think it is actually going to work. Yes, she says, hold breath. Yeah. Okay, good. So when we're looking at under transmitted light, if we're looking at under the UV, looking at under infrared reflectography, these are the different kinds of lights you can see it. So the red outlines is what you see now on the surface. The yellow, the orangey yellow, is what he started, what was underneath. So instead of the black working sails, that means a working boat, there are boats with white sails, which are touristy. That was underneath the original, what the composition you see now. They're the people with top hats, so they're obviously of a different class than the fishermen who were painted over later on at a different time. There you go. So it shows you that Monet, again, from the very get-go, was working to think about what he wanted, and he wasn't content with that, and so he changed the subject, which helps us understand him and the meaning of his paintings. At the Art Institute, we show Monet next to Manet with these two paintings from 1860s. The Manet is this wonderful departure of the boats at Bologna. And just to show you the difference in a very technical way, not just motif-wise. So they're both painting water, they're both painting boats on the water. And if we look at a detail of the Manet, the smoothness of his strokes, he may have started it outdoors with a sketch, but he obviously finished it in the studio, and he's a studio artist first and foremost. Whereas Monet is really sketching out of doors and then coming back into the studio to make those kinds of changes, to make a decision about what is going to be the people in it. And you can see how his brush strokes, he's much more visible, and at the same time you can tell that he's let it dry and then painted over it. And look at the difference in the way he paints water. His understanding of water is incredible, and he has this kind of shorthand that he uses throughout his career. Sometimes it's like this, and you'll see different ways he does it. Here he's just doing these kind of dry brush staccato strokes across to indicate the waves. This was a painting, again, talking about exhibition strategies, that meant a lot to him. And highlighted in yellow are the many times he's shown it, including 1889, which was kind of the culmination of 25 years of his career, when he showed with Rodin at the Galerie Georges Petit, and it was really the retrospective of his midlife career at that time. So this was one that he picked, which meant something very important to him. And I was talking to George Sackerford the other day, and he was like, yeah, but the hut. And I'm like, what hut? And he said, well, there was this painting of the hut that he shows very early in 1867, and then he continues to show it throughout up until this 1889 exhibition at the Galerie Georges Petit. And you're like, why? It's not a riveting subject matter, but I think it has the characteristics of everything that Monet loved about landscape painting, especially this kind of vertiginous viewpoint where he could challenge himself to go up on a cliff and look down. And so these kind of bands of the ground, a subject, and the ground, water, and sky, these three bands that will be so characteristic, so much a signature of his work. And I'm just thinking about 25 years later, he does another hut, this time the Customs House in Varangeville, and these are just several. The one on the bottom is in the Art Institute collection, but the same types of thinking about the framing of the seascape, the land, the water, and this little band of sky above. He does that even in still lifes, and still lifes, like for so many artists, was kind of your fallback in bad days when you couldn't go out, that you'd do still lifes. They were also extremely sellable, commercial, and we're talking 1882, so he's still in the early part of his career before he's completely consumed on many ways by the Americans and making a lot more money. But so this still life still has that kind of vertiginous viewpoint, even though it is a very, in some ways, very banal subject, but he's making such a statement of it. And here you get a sense of how he has evolved his technique from the beach at Saint Adresse to something that is much more confident, much more richly painted. He's incising around the apples to give them a little bit more dimensionality. He's painting wet on wet and doing the highlights. Very wet on wet, you know, you can really mess things up when you're doing wet on wet because the colors can muddy up. I'm no artist, but this is what I understand. And then this kind of thing where he leaves bits of the canvas to show through and to act as highlights and to act as a ground. He leaves the ground open, and that dry brush, so letting it dry and then painting over it and then letting that dry and then maybe scraping off. You get all of these different textures. And this where he's showing, move over Cézanne, because look how he's done the edges of his apples, this blue contour that just perfectly melds them into the composition, but at the same time highlights their dimensionality. And so you see something that seems so simple and so readable on the surface. Once you get up to that surface, none of the images I've shown you are infrared or anything underneath. This is all just surface looking. You can find that he has a very characteristic touch. There is something, besides his confidence, is this incredible ability to keep in harmony many different pure colors and mixed colors at the same time and not have them become mush. That's an art historical term. At the same time, again, vertiginous viewpoints, this is 1882, so the same time as the still life we just saw, Cliff Walk at Pourville, the same bands of landscape. And he's done a series where he's not really a series, but he's thinking about this particular cliff, and he's challenging himself to go up. And so ours is one of the few that actually has figures. It's probably his soon-to-be wife, Alice Hocheday and her daughter, or maybe it's the two Hocheday daughters. But they're just made up of brushwork. There's nothing like the Camille I showed you in the very beginning where you really see a woman wearing a fashion and these are just strokes of color. But I want you to focus in on the hat and the vegetation next to the figure on the right. Look at the way that hat is painted. So again, just this thick application of paint over paint, wet on wet. And then this is, so you don't really see this. This is a macro photograph, so you have to have a microscope. But I just think these are so juicy. I just think that we should just make a calendar of these because they're just so beautiful. Of just looking at all of the colors that go up to making a simple straw hat with maybe a flower or two and a band of ribbon. And then this is the vegetation. This is the foliage next to them, keeping these skeins of color, dry brush, keeping it all so that they separate out, but they still, when you look at them, your eye sees them as this meadow place. And his signature is after it's dried. And that's another signature, no play on words, of Monet, is that he would wait for the canvas to dry, and he would not usually sign them until they were either going out on exhibition or they were going to be sold. So the signature tends to be after he's finished it, when he's really through painting all of the different, thinking of the versions he has in his mind. And this is the sky. And what's interesting about the sky, too, is that it's not just blue and white clouds. He's painted the blue, and then he paints the blue up over the clouds, or he'll paint or vice versa. And you can see sometimes the blue coming through. He's painting it over. Sometimes it's under. So he's already playing with the under-over technique that will become so important when he's doing the reflections in the water lily pond in the last 25 years of his life. But again, the way he's doing his water is very schematic. So it's just this skein of blue and then these little flicks of color. And remember the one from the beach at Saint Adresse, where again, it was just this little staccato, rhythmic, almost choreographed strokes across the water that read very convincingly, but at the same time, when you actually get up close and start thinking about it, you're just so sort of mesmerized by thinking about his hand doing these little marks across the canvas. This was another painting in my favorite collector, Annie Swan Coburn, in her Blackstone hotel. Actually, it wasn't an apartment, it was the hotel. But I'm bringing it up because it shows you she had a very casual way of showing her art. I don't think there was enough wall space. I would have loved to have known her, but I would have been freaked out about, as a curator, I don't think I could have handled this. But what I'm showing it to you for is because of the frame. Because framing, not only the artist's framing of a composition, but the frames itself. And in this case, the frame that she had on it is perfectly acceptable. It was from the dealer, Durand Ruel. And so when they're historic frames, it's really good to keep them on because that's something that his dealer would have approved of, but many times Monet worked with his dealer, which from the 1880s on becomes almost exclusive dealer. This is the one painting that we think was painted just that. It was, he went outside, he did it, it was a one-off, and he left it the way it was. It has no underdrawing. Many times there's a little limited, but there is some kind of an underdrawing. Certainly there's under compositions, and in this case, it's very thinly painted. It's a vertical, it's an unusual format at this time, and he's showing the cliffs at Étretat. And you can tell that it's painted in one coup because he signed it wet on wet. So instead of letting it dry and thinking about it and maybe revisiting it in the studio, he's actually finished it up and he's satisfied with it as it is. But that doesn't mean it's a great painting, and it doesn't mean it's a bad painting. It's just a different painting. So let's look at this. So his hero, besides Manet, was Courbet, Millet, the realists that came in the generation prior to his. And I'm just showing you how these cliffs were touristy, and they're also great motifs for artists like Monet, who again is challenging himself, and just looking at Courbet and what Monet does to Courbet. So this is a Monet of the Étretat in 1882. 3 years later, he's doing something quite different. It's like he's got it down, he knows what it looks like, he's observed it enough, he's got the details, and now he's kind of doing a code, he's simplifying it, he's doing something that seems much lighter and more abstract in many ways. And if you just look at the boats, he knows boats, he grew up with boats, he's a great boat painter, but you can see here, he's not just painting the boats, but he's also left areas where he either was going to paint a boat and he decided to leave out the boat, or he decided to start a boat and then, oh, this looks good, I'm just going to leave it there. So you can't read it as well as the painting on the right, where everything is very distinct except for the people that are these little ciphers, because he doesn't really like to be around people. He tries to eliminate them when possible. And then just this quick, just to show you how those boats are actually made up. They read as boats, but they don't read as boats like the earlier painting. They're very much strokes on canvas. And then what I love about this painting is this is the sail. You know, the one thing that should be sort of flowing in the wind, and he just globs orange paint on it like his signature. He just smashes orange paint into it so that it really reads. It doesn't read as a sail when you get up close to it, but when you're looking at it as a whole, it's perfectly acceptable for what it is, the sail reflected in the water. Everything changes after that 1889 exhibition where he, as I said, it was the culmination of his career to date. He had experimented with doing the same subject several times. We think of the Gare Saint-Lazare series that he did in 1877, but it was really when he rents and eventually purchases the property at Giverny that he gets this idea of focusing on this pivotal moment where he's going to focus exclusively on one subject under different atmospheric effects. And of course, the first series is the stacks of wheat or stacks of grain or grain stacks. I mean, we've called it so many things. Monet referred to them as meule, which simply means stack. So he gives us nothing that we can work with. So many art historians have decided which grain is actually being shown here, but we're fortunate to have 6, as I said, of the 25 that we know about. So we can really look at these in a way that we couldn't with the other ones, because you're apples to boats, but now we're apples to apples. We're really looking at something that allows us to see gradations of technique and also kind of judge it in a non-judgmental way. One of the other great collectors in Chicago was Mrs. Potter Palmer. She gave us 7 Monets from her vast collection at the end of her life, and that was willed to us in 1922. She was kind of a discoverer of Monet and the first one to really embrace the idea of series paintings when she saw them at his exhibition at Durand-Ruel in May of 1891, and she bought 3 immediately. In the following year, she bought 2 more. So she understood what he was trying to do, and this was something, I mean, it seems banal now because series, but serial painting was definitely something that Monet is bringing to the whole history of modern art. And there you see how she has it in her picture gallery. She was quite the grande dame. And these are not just little muffin-like forms. They're 16 to 18 feet high. They're on his property at Giverny, and so he's looking out and looking at something that's close to him. It's practically in his front yard, and he's thinking about them in terms of a motif. And for Monet, motifs were important not just because, okay, this means something to me because it's on my property, but also it became a way of referencing what kind of framing he was going to do, what kind of compositional strategies. And each motif, as you saw Etretat in the vertical form, required a different way of approaching the composition. So we have 6 in the Art Institute, and they look very similar, but if you get up close and look at them, they're quite different. And when we were doing this online scholarly look, this beneath the surface look with these different kinds of scientific aids, these examination tools, we realized that he did not paint this at one time, that this was anything but, that this was the result of having started them outside, brought them in, and it's probably the first time that he's thinking about the ensemble, about the harmony between one painting to the other. So he brings them in from these different times of the year, but he's never going to let them go until he's completed them in a way that he feels they work well together. And when he shows the 15 in 1891, it is the ensemble, which is a new kind of rationale for his approach to painting. And you can see, you can't see this with the naked eye. Well, you kind of can. If you know it's there, you can see Pentimenti, but not really. It's better to go online and do what I'm doing right here. But sometimes he actually takes away a stack. Sometimes he puts another one in. I mean, these are big changes. These aren't just tweaks here and there. This is probably the first one that he did in the series, one of the first, where it's very legible. You kind of know where you are. You see the houses. You see the terrain. But look at these. I mean, he's just outlining the stacks and leaving a little bit of the canvas to show through. So he's working again with letting it dry and going back in and emphasizing certain parts of it with this incredible way of showing the sky, this kind of yellow glow along the sky. Look how impastoed it is. You can follow his brushwork. And again, it's not just painted in one go. It's layering and layering and returning to it and scraping off and doing something different. This is one where he actually eliminated a stack that you can see traces of when you're looking at under the different tools. And another one, but this one's interesting because where the paint doesn't quite cover, where it's kind of chipping, there you can see green. So we know he actually switched the seasons from the snowy end result, but he probably started it as a spring. So it's not just compositional changes, it's actual atmospheric seasonal year changes. And it's also really good when we do exhibitions. This is the one we did in 1990, when you have a lot from different institutions, which we did, you can look at the quality of the paint. You can also look at the condition and see ours were really over varnished with synthetic varnish. And after this exhibition, we went through and de-varnished and sometimes relined because they were, stretched within an inch of their lives, because every conservator wants to work on a Monet, and so they get overworked on. And really just kind of loosened them up and gave them a second life. But also, this was a moment when we decided we had to reframe we reframed all but one, because they had such a variety of frames, and we wanted them to look like the ensemble that Monet made them to be. This isn't just one of those condition problems, so a very beautiful but challenging painting. These are some of the changes he made to it from Mrs. Coburn, the woman who puts paintings on the floor of her hotel room. But I just wanted to show it to you because I think it's really interesting. This is a painting that Mrs. Potter Palmer bought, sent back, bought again, sent back. I mean, this painting travels to her several times. It doesn't go too far afield. And then finally, it ends up with Mrs. Annie Swan Coburn. So the condition is sometimes also interesting in terms of why did they want it back once she turned it in? What was it? But one of the things that this painting, I think, has had happen. I think either it's Monet or condition, but there's a real muddiness about this that may come from it having been overlined, too much lined at one time, and the impasto is kind of smushed down. If you think about it, when I showed you the ones with the outline and how amazingly three-dimensional the outlines were, and you could really feel the paint. And here it's sort of, you miss that skeins of color. You miss that amazing ability to keep everything going at the same time, to juggle these colors. It kind of becomes this. So that's a condition, I think. The other series we have is the series of the Thames. So between 1901 and 1903, Monet went in the winters to London, where he painted, and in 1904 he shows 37 of them in an exhibition of Durand Ruel, these different, the Thames, the different bridges along the Thames and the Houses of Parliament, and we have 4 from that series. So again, it's a really interesting way of comparing apples to apples. And how many people saw the Monet exhibition at Courtauld this year? So that was a wonderful experience because they actually reconstructed probably, yeah, it's not a liquid, reconstructed the paintings that were shown in 1904. And so you could really look at them and see, okay, why did this painting get chosen and this one didn't? This is the catalog. These are the different types. And here we are in the Courtauld. It was a very small space, and so it quickly got crazy. But it was great because you could, there I am over there. So we have 3 of the bridges, and I'm showing you now the Charing Cross Bridge, which is just ephemeral. These paintings, again, he refused to show them. Durand Ruel, his dealer, was like, you know, come on, I'm paying for your materials, I'm paying for your trip, come on already, let's have it. And he was like, no, you know, I've got to keep going. And he actually struggles to get it right, the fog that makes London London. And that's why he likes to go in the winter when the fog and the smog are one. And this is the other Waterloo Bridge. And I want to talk about this one, another Waterloo Bridge, completely different palette. We don't know exactly when these were done, but this one was shown in 1904. So he chose this one to be seen as part of those 37. And I just want to show a little bit about his technique. So here, he's actually scraping away the paint to let the ground color show through and become the steam coming off of those, whatever those, I don't know, they don't have cars in 1902, I don't know, carriages with some kind of a lights, but it's just such an interesting technique. And then to counter that, he's just splashing on. Antaya Callan calls it the tongue lickings. And it is kind of like that, or it's like finger painting. He's so confident that he can just throw these colors together in these blotches, and they read as the lights in the vehicles that are crossing the bridge. And I just can't stop thinking about this hat. And the way that the hat, which started that whole idea of the tongue lickings, continues throughout his career, where he just does it quickly, but at the same time with such majesty that it holds up and it describes something. At the same time, it's just a blob of lots of colors. But as I said, he really did struggle with this series. He was... I'm just pointing out some, you know, he's like, I should have stopped. I shouldn't have gone further. And he kept going further. And he knew he was ruining some of them. He knew that if he had just done the first round, instead of bringing them back to Giverny and starting over and even taking some of them back to London to be able to go back out there and see if things had changed and what he's going to do. So it's this back and forth. And, you know, Monet's a whiner. And he's away from Alice a lot. And so he's got to also tell her why he's not home. But it's still, it's just, it's sad because you can tell that he has an idea, but he can't get there in this series. This is one of the paintings that it was in the Courtauld exhibition. And I'm just pointing it out because I think it's a little different. I think it's also had some condition, interesting enough, a condition, and I also think it lacks that impasto, that just those flickers that give life to these bridges. And that is the case with our painting of the Houses of Parliament. This is from an 1895 exhibition we did where, again, apples to apples, we could really see how do ours compare with some that are unvarnished, untouched, and ours, since they've been in the Art Institute since 1922 or 1933, have been majorly touched. So Houses of Parliament, which is perfectly acceptable, but it wasn't shown in the exhibition. He didn't choose it, nor was it purchased until 1916. So even though this was hugely popular, this exhibition, this painting remained with him. And again, 1903, he's writing back, I need to be, did I put 2000? Oh no, 1903, need to be able to see them all. My mistake was to retouch them. You lose the impression, you lose what you're trying to do. Those attempts, lay-ins could have been shown, but now that I've retouched all of them, I must at all costs go through to the end. So it's like, once you start something, you got to keep going. You paint part of your room, and then the rest of the room looks dingy. You got to keep going until they all look the same. And I just think he went too far. I think he overdid it. He gets heavy-handed, and you're seeing that these blues that he adds, instead of being touches that add life and dynamism to the painting, actually kind of flatten it out, and they don't have the same rationale that you see in his other paintings. It's a hard thing to explain. I'm showing you, I'm hoping you are kind of feeling it, but sometimes they're just straight stripes of blue that really don't add to the atmospheric effects or to the description of what he's trying to express. And we know that too because there are two signatures. There's one underneath the other. So most likely, as I said, he signed his paintings when he was exhibiting them or selling them. So most likely he finished it, signed it, and then I'm going to go back to it, I'm going to keep working, and then he re-signed it, scraped off the old signature and re-signed it, and that was probably the kiss of death for that painting. That was not the case with the wonderful water lilies from 1906 that was given to us by Martin A. Ryerson, another of the three most important collectors for early Impressionist paintings in Chicago. And here you see in his house on Drexel, which still exists, this square canvas. So now we're seeing something new in his works. We started seeing with the Houses of Parliament, where he's closing the rectangular window and the vertical that we associate with portrait paintings, and he's using this square. He will use the square and double square, which really changes the way he has to think about approaching a painting, because now it's a square which is thinking about horizons. Everything has to shift to meet the demands of the new format. Monet wasn't very experimental. He wasn't like Gauguin. He didn't experiment with canvases. He bought pre-primed canvases, most of the conventional stretcher bars. But gradually he starts thinking about these different formats. This is a painting that was exhibited in an exhibition that he also worked towards for 3 years, finally shown in 1909, these passages d'eau, these water landscapes, again, Durand-Ruel pushing him, and he's saying no. So now he's got his water lily pond at Giverny. Now he's not having to go schlepping off to London with his materials and ordering. He can actually just take his time and really think about these reflective qualities. The signature is over dry, so it's. And then you have this incredible building up of paint layers that have been allowed to dry, started again, and the impasto and the three-dimensionality is just overwhelmingly beautiful. And then even in these really very thinly painted, he lets them dry, he paints it over again, and so you can sometimes see the brushwork underneath the brushwork of the next layer, which is equally thin. And this is that starting to layer that you'll see in the late water lilies, where he's really trying to figure out how do you make a reflection and have a sense of the plants coming up, having a sense of the of the light shining down, and you're getting the reflection off the vegetation on the side. And so it's like these very different challenges that he's now posing to himself. And this, where he's just building up with the brushwork, and I love this one, where it's wet over wet and dry. So some of it's wet, 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 just putting it together like those little tongue licks, and then also letting it dry. And then where he has pure color, this just all of a sudden, just this little rickrack of pure green color that just works, even though when you get up to it, it's nothing but a little squiggle. And then I love macro. I like these micrographs. I just think, I have to do it again. There's that hat. I just keep seeing the hat and everything he does. It's like, okay, yeah. And then there's from the Waterloo Bridge. They keep coming up. He loves this orange and red combination that works so well for anything from water lilies to lights on a bridge. Again, we had the opportunity to look at these and see their condition and see them judged with other paintings of the same moment, of the same subject matter. And once again, we were struck with we needed to reframe our painting to make it fit with to make it look like a Monet frame. He loved Louis XIII frames, so we reframed it. It's not a real one, but it's close enough. And in by 1920, Monet is already, since 1914, working on the great project, his obsession with the water lilies that is going to be in the Orangerie that's commissioned by Clemenceau. But by now, he's recognized as the great national hero of French painting, and he's been recognized by the Americans for over 20 years. And so he has a studio that he dedicates to his paintings, kind of like a picture gallery, and then he has a giant studio that he has built for the murals, the monumental murals. But just to show you that even though he was painting and selling, there were some paintings that he just kept, like this one. There were paintings that meant a lot to him, an early painting that were points of reference for him, even though he had long moved on to landscape painting by 1890s when he starts the series. You're not going to find figures in his paintings. And I just love the fact that he's got them just willy-nilly, and people come in and they can see early paintings, they can see paintings of Norway on one visit. They can, you can identify all of these. So some of them are his water lilies that he's just left in a kind of unfinished state, but that doesn't mean he didn't think they were finished. There were just some paintings that meant a lot to him, and he wasn't ready to part with them. So the last section, very quickly, is his Rise, Fall, Revival. So 1920 to 1960. So as I said, he's working on the water lily cycle that will be in the Orangerie, and he's got this giant studio for that. But something happens. He decides he needs them all and he doesn't want to sell them. And Ryerson, who you met earlier in this presentation, our wonderful Ryerson, goes as a trustee of the Art Institute. And the story is he's going to have $3 million to pay for 30 of these mural-sized paintings. And we have it in our archives of him visiting with another trustee. And Monet says no. He says, I'm not selling them. And in fact, he only sells very few. In fact, one of them is in the Met. The Annenberg water lilies is one of the few that was sold in the 1920s. So he finishes the Orangerie, and then he dies. He dies actually before it's installed, and he kind of gets lost. Cubism is on the rise. They say he's committed artistic suicide. This one quote is that, it's the ugliest gift ever given to the state, this Orangerie. And it suddenly seems really old and fusty and not new, not what we need in art. And all of these paintings that he didn't sell stay in his studio. And eventually World War II, and eventually the Orangerie is shut up and no one can see it. And even after the war is over, there's so much damage, they can't open it up again. So I wanted to show this one because this is one that was bought after. His son is what is the real hero in this. His son, Michel, the only surviving son, lives until 1960. He doesn't have children. He returns to Giverny and he sees all these things, and he works with a number of dealers in Paris, and he starts selling to Americans because guess what? It's time for abstract expressionism. And suddenly these big, formless, seemingly formless, big, all over paintings with no horizon, suddenly they're seen very interesting as a way for them to learn. And so they're revisiting Monet, and his star starts to shine again, even though he's under the ground. This is one that was sold by Michel to Mrs. Kaplan, who gave it to us. And you can tell, usually they don't have a signature, and this did have a signature stamp, but Monet would finish the painting when he added his signature. So the ones that have this kind of empty corner, it's because they were still in his studio. Today I went to the Museum of Modern Art, and I was reminded that even Lily Bliss, who bought Cézanne and Van Gogh, he was not considered among the canon of Alfred Barr of the great moderns. He just wasn't. Gauguin, Cézanne, Seurat, but not here. And they got their water lilies. They bought it in the 1950s when this resurgence of interest, as did the Nelson Atkins, these big paintings. And that's when we acquired one of our 2 paintings that we bought rather than was given, the irises by the curator, Catherine Q at the time, this big 9 by 10 painting of the irises that was, that's never been lined. And it's really, really interesting to think about. That's a state stamp. But Michel was going to make sure that you knew it was his. So he stamped it, authenticized, and he stamped it on the back of so 3 stamps. But I'm just thinking also about the Monet, Joan Mitchell, the second generation. So you have the Pollock generation, and then you have the second generation of Ellsworth Kelly and Joan Mitchell. They're discovering, and I think it was a brilliant idea, the Fondation Vuitton, to put them together to show how much she was indebted to Monet's ability to cover these huge surfaces and never lose track of where he was going. Now, it's very difficult. It's not like Van Gogh. There's a forgery every day. There's one out now. It's very difficult to have a fake Monet because Wildenstein did such a great job of inventorying it. And during Monet's life, he started. Michel Monet had all of the inventory left in the studio. And so you have a lot of information, precious information, to help us sort out. There was one recently in that fakes or forgery that I'm not going to get into, but I don't know, that was maybe. But if we look at the market now, this is, and I have to get out my little sheet because I'm not good with numbers. You know, Monet is still a blue chip artist, but if you just do a summary on ArtNet from 2023 to 2024, none of the paintings sold were from the 1860s. One was from the 1870s, and out of the other 18, they were all from the time of the 1880s when he's at Giverny, of subjects of Giverny and around Giverny. Very few don't sell because he is still a blue chip artist, and of the 15 that were bought in over 6 or 7 years, the one on the left was bought in, and I think it's because it didn't have a studio stamp. And it does have a studio stamp, but I think it's because the technique was very much like his pastels that he did. He did about 26 pastels in London, and he was just doing that while he was waiting for paints to arrive, and so he's kind of using a different technique. And I get the feeling that he tried to kind of transcribe that technique to oil painting, and it didn't quite gel. Anyway, it didn't sell. So I think what I'm trying to say is that you should by now know what is a Monet and what is a Manet. This quiz, you should take it. You're going to do great. And just to kind of summarize what we've been talking about tonight. So from the beginning, he was a very confident artist. He was also very calculated. He was also very intentional. Even the series paintings, the way he controlled how they were going to be seen, when they were going to be seen. He's an artist that has a sense of joie de vivre, but at the same time, it's very much intentional with him. You've seen a lot of juicy details, but they're not just from the tube like Van Gogh would do later on. These are heavy impasto. They look like they could have been finger painted on, but they're all brushed work. And as Anthea Callan has put it, it's like he gives us a sense of a sensory experience. They're emotional, they're sensory, and they're exploratory at the same way. And because most of the paintings after 1888 are landscapes, there's a real sense of universality, there's a timelessness that you don't find in figure paintings, which are by the chronology, what they're wearing. They're just limited in that sense. So as the great art historian Meyer Shapiro said, no artist can bat 1,000 all the time, but I think Monet, even when he's not great, it's worth a second look, a closer look. Thank you. Thank you.